Have you ever wondered what happens when two completely different worlds collide? A billionaire and a struggling waitress. Two lives that were never meant to cross paths. But fate had other plans. Before we dive into this captivating story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Stories TH so you never miss a powerful story like this. Fateful moment. Setting the scene. Harlem, New York, a neighborhood rich in history, culture, and an unspoken tension between past and present. It is a place where ambition and struggle walk hand in hand, where the echoes of jazz and activism still linger in the air, but so do the hardships of those trying to carve a better future. Among them is Ava Sinclair, a young woman in her mid-20s, standing behind the counter of La Lumiere, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The name itself, French for the light, is ironic to Ava because she has never felt more invisible. She watches as the elite of New York come and go, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor, their laughter echoing in a space where she is nothing more than background noise. She is not bitter, at least. She tells herself she isn't. But there is something profoundly disheartening about serving luxury dishes she could never afford, pouring wine that costs more than her monthly rent, and smiling at guests who barely acknowledge her existence. The billionaire who doesn't belong. Meanwhile, in a completely different world, or at least a different part of New York, Dorian Lancaster is pacing inside his penthouse overlooking the city. He has it all, at least on paper. A family empire, wealth beyond imagination, invitations to exclusive galas, and a future carved out for him before he was even born. Yet, something is missing. Something he can't quite put into words. Born into privilege, Dorian has never had to fight for anything, but that has left him feeling detached, disconnected from the world. His every move is scrutinized, every decision analyzed by shareholders, journalists, and his own family, who expect him to uphold the Lancaster name with perfection. But tonight, he doesn't feel like playing his role. He is supposed to be an elite networking event, but the thought of another evening filled with empty conversations and forced smiles makes him restless. So, instead, he takes a detour, a walk through the streets of Harlem, a place his father would scoff at. But to him, it's real. It's raw. It's not manufactured perfection. The wrong turn that changed everything. Dorian wasn't supposed to be here, not in this part of town, not in this particular moment, and certainly not inside La Lumiere. Yet, here he is, standing at the entrance, drawn in by curiosity. He doesn't belong here, but something about stepping into a place so different from his usual world feels liberating. No one expects anything from him here. No one knows who he is, or so he thinks. A few heads turn as he enters, recognizing him not personally, but from magazine covers, financial news, and society pages. He can feel their gazes lingering, whispers beginning to form, but he ignores them. All he wants is a drink, and maybe, just maybe, a moment to exist without expectation. But fate has other plans. Somewhere between finding the bar and ordering a whiskey, he takes a wrong turn. A small mistake. One that should have been insignificant. Yet it isn't. The meeting that shouldn't have happened. Ava had just finished refilling a tray of wine glasses when she decided to step into the restroom for a brief moment of silence. She had spent the last 2 hours weaving through tables, dodging entitled guests, snapping their fingers at her like she was disposable, and pretending not to hear the inappropriate comments some men made when they thought she wasn't listening. She just needed 30 seconds of peace. But peace was the last thing she got, because as soon as she stepped toward the sinks, she heard the heavy footsteps of someone entering behind her. She turned around, expecting to see one of the other waitresses, but instead, she found herself staring at a man in an expensive black suit, his eyes scanning the room with confusion. A man who clearly wasn't supposed to be here. Dorian Lancaster. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with awkwardness. Ava blinked. "You do realize this is the women's restroom, right?" Dorian glanced around, his brows furrowing as if just now realizing his mistake. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Ava folded her arms. "How does someone like you even end up in the wrong restroom?" Thought billionaires had personal assistants to guide them through basic human functions. Dorian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, a flicker of amusement crossing his otherwise composed face. "Trust me, I don't make a habit of this." Ava smirked. Could have fooled me. She expected him to leave. Rich men don't like being made fun of. They don't like being embarrassed. But instead of storming out, Dorian chuckled a low, genuine sound that caught Ava off guard. The photo that changed everything. If their interaction had ended there, it would have been nothing more than an odd, mildly amusing mistake. But someone had guessed, a waiter, or maybe even one of the managers had a phone. And in this digital age, privacy is a luxury no one truly has. By the time Dorian stepped out of the restroom, a photo had already been taken. By the time he reached the front doors, a message had already been sent. And by the time Ava returned to the dining area, she noticed a shift in the energy, a buzz, a ripple of curiosity spreading like wildfire. Some people whispered behind napkins. Others blatantly stared at her like she was suddenly something worth noticing. And then her phone vibrated. A single notification, a news alert. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the headline. Billionaire Dorian Lancaster spotted in women's restroom with a mysterious woman. Ava's stomach dropped, because that mysterious woman was her. And nothing in her life would ever be the same again. What should have been a simple, meaningless mistake had turned into a full-blown internet frenzy. Ava wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was now part of a story she never signed up for. And Dorian? Well, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the narrative. Neither of them knew it yet, but this one moment would change everything. Parallel worlds, two opposing class struggles. A life lived in the shadows. Ava Sinclair had spent most of her life feeling like a spectator watching from the sidelines as others lived the kind of life she could only dream of. Born and raised in Harlem, she had learned early on that effort alone was not enough to change one's fate. She had seen her mother work double shifts as a cleaner, coming home exhausted, only to wake up before dawn and do it all over again. Ava had promised herself she would do better. She studied hard, worked even harder, and yet, here she was a waitress in a high-end restaurant, serving people who wouldn't even bother to look her in the eye. Every night, she witnessed the same routine. Wealthy patrons waltzing in, expecting perfect service, snapping their fingers, barely acknowledging the existence of the people who catered to their every whim. She wasn't bitter. At least, that's what she told herself. But there was a quiet frustration building inside her, a feeling that no matter how hard she tried, the world had already decided who she was, just another girl from Harlem, another invisible worker in a city that never slept. She hated it, not just the work, but the way it reduced her to nothing. The loneliness of privilege. Dorian Lancaster had everything money could buy except a reason to wake up in the morning. His world was one of tailored suits, high-rise penthouses, luxury cars, and private jets, yet none of it felt real. Born into wealth, he had never known struggle, not the kind that people like Ava face daily. His problems were never about survival, but about legacy. From the moment he could walk, he had been expected to live up to the Lancaster name. He was never given the choice to be anything else. His father, a ruthless businessman, had built an empire on power, and he expected Dorian to do the same. Every decision was calculated, every move scrutinized. Yet, despite all of it, Dorian felt empty. He was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. Everyone wanted something from him: money, status, connections, but no one actually cared about who he was beneath the wealth. His relationships were transactional. His friendships were surface level. Even the women who pursued him seemed more interested in his last name than his personality. No one looked at Dorian the way Ava did, like he was just another guy, not a billionaire, not an untouchable elite, just a man. It unnerved him. It intrigued him. And it made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, Ava saw something in him that no one else did. Two worlds that were never meant to collide. Ava had never been in the presence of someone like Dorian Lancaster before. Sure, she had served men like him, rich, powerful, untouchable, but she had never actually interacted with one beyond forced pleasantries. And now, thanks to one stupid mistake, her name was being mentioned in the same breath as his. The internet was ablaze with speculation. Who was she? Was she his girlfriend? A scandal waiting to happen? Ava didn't have the luxury of laughing at the absurdity of it all. Unlike Dorian, she couldn't just disappear into a penthouse and let the media clean up the mess. She still had to go to work, still had to take the subway, still had to exist in a world where she was nothing more than another worker in the system. Except now, people looked at her differently. Her coworkers stared. The manager asked her too many questions. Customers whispered when she walked past. And then Dorian showed up at the restaurant. Ava felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward them. She clenched her fists, resenting how easily he commanded attention. The opposing perspectives. Dorian leaned against the counter, looking perfectly at ease despite the tension radiating from Ava. "Nice place," he said casually. Ava narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" Dorian smirked. "Just checking in. You seem upset." "Upset?" Ava let out a bitter laugh. "You think this is funny?" Dorian arched a brow. "I think it's ridiculous. The media takes a single picture, and suddenly we have a scandal on our hands. It's almost amusing." Ava stared at him, appalled at how lightly he was taking this. "Of course, you find it amusing," she said sharply. "This is just another day for you. Another headline, another controversy that won't affect you in the slightest. But me? My life is being turned upside down because people think I what? Had a secret meeting with a billionaire in a bathroom? Do you even understand what that means for someone like me?" Dorian frowned slightly, caught off guard by the weight in her words. "Someone like you?" he echoed. Ava exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you? You live in a world where your mistakes don't matter. You could burn $1 million in front of a crowd, and they'd call you eccentric. But me? People like me don't get second chances. The moment I step out of line, I become the joke. The scandal. The problem." Dorian didn't answer right away. For the first time, he saw beyond Ava's sharp words and defensive posture. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight she carried, the way she had been fighting battles he never even knew existed. And for the first time in his life, he felt ashamed of his own privilege. The realization that changes everything. Dorian had never considered the imbalance of power between them. To him, this situation was a mild inconvenience. To Ava, it was a potential catastrophe. And yet, despite everything, she refused to let him see her as weak. There was fire in her eyes, a resilience that fascinated him. "You're right," he finally admitted. Ava blinked. "Wait, what?" Dorian exhaled. "You're right. I don't get it. I've never had to think about things the way you do. But that doesn't mean I can't start." Ava studied him carefully, searching for sarcasm, for condescension, but she found none. For the first time, Dorian Lancaster looked genuinely human to her. And for the first time, Ava realized that maybe, just maybe, this arrogant, privileged man wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. They came from different worlds. They were never supposed to cross paths. But now, they were tangled in a story neither of them could control. And neither of them was ready for what would come next. The scandal erupts when the media twists the truth. The headline that changed everything. The morning after the incident, Ava Sinclair woke up to a reality she hadn't chosen. Her phone was vibrating nonstop, messages flooding in, some from coworkers, others from unknown numbers. At first, she thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe someone had gotten the wrong number. Then she saw it. The headline, bold and blaring, stretched across every major news site. Young millionaire Dorian Lancaster spotted with a mysterious woman. Coincidence or secret affair? Another one was worse. A scandal in the making. What is Dorian Lancaster hiding? Ava's stomach dropped. This wasn't happening. Her hands trembled as she clicked through the articles. They had taken a single photo, just a blurry, poorly lit shot of Dorian and her leaving the restroom at different times, and spun it into something scandalous. The news had everything: speculation, innuendos, theories. Who was she? Was she his secret lover? Was she blackmailing him? Was this part of some elite scandal in the making? The comments were worse. Another gold digger trying to trap a rich guy. Classic. I bet she planned this. Why else would a random waitress be near a billionaire? This is why rich men should stay away from commoners. Drama always follows. Ava's breath hitched. They were tearing her apart. The internet frenzy when rumors become reality. By midday, the situation had escalated. Social media was flooded with conspiracy theories, ranging from absurd to outright offensive. Some claimed she had seduced Dorian for money. Others speculated that she was an undercover journalist digging for dirt on the elite. The most outrageous theories suggested this was all a publicity stunt orchestrated by Dorian's family. Ava felt like she was suffocating. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. In the eyes of the public, she was already guilty. At work, she could feel people staring. Some whispered as she passed by. Others watched with open curiosity. She had become a spectacle in her own life. It was humiliating. And worse, she had no control over it. The pressure on Dorian. While Ava's world was falling apart, Dorian Lancaster was dealing with his own set of problems. The scandal had reached his father's office before he even had a chance to react. He stood in front of the Lancaster Group's board members, his father at the head of the table, staring at him with a mixture of disappointment and frustration. "This is unacceptable," his father, William Lancaster, said, placing a newspaper on the table. "Fix it." Dorian clenched his jaw. "It's just gossip. It'll die down in a few days." His father's eyes narrowed. "No, it won't. Because you're not just some playboy anymore. You're the face of this company. Every move you make reflects on us." Dorian exhaled. "So what do you want me to do? Issue a statement saying I accidentally walked into the wrong bathroom? Because that'll make me look like an idiot." William leaned forward. "I don't care how you handle it, but get rid of the story. Now." Dorian left the office with a storm brewing inside him. He hated how easily his father dismissed things, how he treated people like chess pieces, moving them around for convenience. But the worst part? He knew the only way to kill a story was to control the narrative. And that meant Ava wasn't getting out of this unscathed. A deal with the devil? That evening, Dorian walked into La Lumiere, the restaurant where Ava worked. The moment she saw him, she stiffened. "You!" she hissed, dragging him toward the back to avoid prying eyes. "Why are you here?" Dorian, cool as ever, gave her an easy smile. "Relax. I'm here to help." Ava folded her arms. "Oh, really? Because last I checked, your name isn't being dragged through the dirt. Mine is." Dorian's expression darkened. "You think this isn't affecting me? I have a board breathing down my neck. My father wants this story gone." Ava scoffed. "And let me guess you're here to offer me a deal?" Dorian held up his hands. "Look, whether we like it or not, we're in this together. The more we fight it, the worse it gets." Ava narrowed her eyes. "So what's your brilliant plan?" He hesitated for a second before saying, "We pretend it's real." Silence. Ava blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "We give them what they want," Dorian said smoothly. "A short-lived relationship to satisfy the public's curiosity. Then, in a few weeks, we break it off quietly." Ava stared at him. "You're insane." Dorian smirked. "Maybe, but it's the fastest way to get them off your back." She wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at her to reject his ridiculous offer. But the truth was, she was drowning. And this might be the only way to survive. When choice is an illusion. Ava didn't have the luxury of choices. If she refused, the media would continue to tear her apart. If she agreed, she would be stepping into a lie, one she wasn't sure she could escape from. Dorian, however, had everything to gain and nothing to lose. And that made her resent him even more. She exhaled sharply. "Fine, but I have conditions." Dorian raised a brow. "Go on. When I don't quit my job, I'm not going to play the role of Billionaire's girlfriend full-time." Dorian nodded. "Fair. I don't do anything that makes me look weak. I'm not going to be some arm candy for you." Dorian smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." Ava studied him, searching for any sign of deception. She found none. Still, something about this felt like a deal with the devil. But she was out of options. She extended her hand. "We do this on my terms." Dorian took her hand in his. Agreed. As their fingers touched, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. The scandal had started with one single photo. But now, it was spiraling into something far bigger, something neither of them could control. And as Ava stepped into this dangerous game, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about clearing their names anymore. This was about who would come out of this unscathed and who would be destroyed. The false agreement, a difficult choice. The unthinkable proposition. Ava Sinclair had always known that the world ran on deals, powerful people pulling strings behind closed doors, striking bargains that kept the elite in control, while everyone else was left to survive on scraps. But she never imagined she'd be asked to make one herself. Sitting across from Dorian Lancaster, a man who could buy anything with a flick of his wrist, she struggled to process what he had just proposed. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?" she repeated, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it less absurd. Dorian leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed. For a few weeks, maybe a month at most, just long enough for the scandal to die down. Ava let out a sharp laugh. "That has to be the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." Dorian smirked. "Then I guess you don't read the tabloids much." Ava folded her arms. "I'm not for sale." Dorian exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "It's not about money. It's about control. Right now, the media is tearing both of us apart. If we let them run wild, they'll dictate the story. But if we do this, if we control the narrative, we take the power back." Ava shook her head. "And what do I get out of this?" "A front row seat to your privileged world." Dorian's gaze sharpened. "You get protection. Right now, you're a scandal waiting to happen. But if you're with me, no one will touch you. The story shifts. You're not some random girl caught in a bathroom scandal. You're my girlfriend." Ava clenched her fists. "And what happens when it's over? When you're done playing pretend?" Dorian shrugged. "We break up, quietly, with mutual respect, and the media moves on." Ava's jaw tightened. "And what if I say no?" Dorian's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, there was something almost genuine in his voice. "Then you'll have to face this alone. The reality of no choice." Ava wanted to walk away. She wanted to tell Dorian to shove his proposal and let him handle his own mess. But the truth was he wasn't wrong. Since the scandal had erupted, her life had spiraled out of control. She had lost shifts at work because customers didn't want drama around them. Her landlord had suddenly started hinting at increasing rent, as if her newfound unwanted fame meant she had money. She had even received threats online, accusing her of seducing a billionaire for personal gain. It wasn't just the media. The world had already made up its mind about her. And no matter what she did, she couldn't win. She wasn't naive. She knew that for people like her, choices were an illusion. The rich always had doors open for them. The poor, they had to kick and claw their way into opportunity. So maybe this was her door. A fake relationship with a billionaire wasn't exactly the dream she had for herself. But what if it wasn't just about survival? What if it was a way out? The reluctant agreement. The next day, Ava stood outside a sleek, glass-covered skyscraper in Manhattan, the headquarters of Lancaster Industries. Her stomach twisted. This was Dorian's world, not hers. But if she wanted to change her fate, she had to step inside. When she entered the private lounge on the top floor, Dorian was already there, sitting at a table with a legal contract in front of him. Ava exhaled sharply. "This is a mistake." Dorian smirked. "Maybe, but it's our mistake now." She hesitated before sitting down. "Let's get this straight. I'm doing this on my terms." Dorian nodded. "Of course. I keep my job. I don't change my life for you. Phoenix. And if you ever try to control me..." Dorian raised a hand. "I wouldn't dream of it." Ava studied him carefully, then reached for the contract. It was all there, laid out in cold, professional terms. She would be Dorian Lancaster's official girlfriend for a fixed period. No real relationship, just a carefully staged romance for the public eye. And when it was over, they would go their separate ways. Simple, clean. At least it should have been. She grabbed the pen and signed her name. As soon as she did, Dorian smirked. "Welcome to the Lancaster brand, sweetheart." Ava scowled. This was going to be hell. Part 4. The first public test. Their first appearance as a couple was scheduled for the next evening, a high-profile charity gala filled with New York's wealthiest elites. Ava had never felt more out of place. She stood in front of a full-length mirror in a borrowed designer gown, trying to recognize the woman staring back at her. Dorian had arranged for her to look the part, which apparently meant wearing something worth more than her entire savings account. She hated it, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it wasn't her. When she stepped out of the dressing room, Dorian looked her up and down, his usual smirk appearing. Well, he murmured. "You clean up nicely." Ava crossed her arms. Say one more word, and I'm walking out. Dorian chuckled. Relax, Sinclair. You're supposed to be my girlfriend, remember? Maybe try looking a little less like you want to strangle me. Ava forced a tight smile. Better. Dorian grinned. Getting there. She exhaled sharply. How do people live like this? Dorian adjusted his cufflinks. With a lot of money and very little self-awareness. Before Ava could roll her eyes, a sleek black car pulled up. Showtime, Dorian said smoothly, offering his arm. Ava hesitated, then took it. As soon as they stepped onto the red carpet, the flashes exploded. Cameras, journalists, paparazzi. Ava fought the instinct to run. Dorian, however, was the picture of calm. He smiled effortlessly, pulling Ava closer, playing his part perfectly. And that's when Ava realized she wasn't in control anymore. This wasn't just a game. This was a performance. And if she wasn't careful, it would consume her whole. Ava had agreed to one lie, one carefully constructed illusion to survive the scandal. But as she stepped further into Dorian's world, she began to wonder. Had she just signed away her freedom? And more terrifyingly, had she just signed away herself? What money can't buy. Part 1. A ticket to the elite. Ava had always known that money bought access to the best seats, the best food, the best treatment. But she never understood just how deep the divide was until the night she stepped into Dorian Lancaster's world. The charity gala was held in one of Manhattan's most exclusive venues, a place where the chandeliers cost more than most people's homes, and the champagne never stopped flowing. Ava felt every pair of curious, judgmental eyes on her the second she walked in. Women in shimmering gowns whispered behind their glasses of wine. Men in tailored suits barely acknowledged her, as if she were a decoration rather than a guest. Dorian, on the other hand, moved through the crowd with effortless ease. He was used to this world. He belonged here. Ava? She was an intruder. She clutched her glass of champagne, resisting the urge to shrink under the weight of their stares. Then, a woman in a floor-length silver gown stepped forward, her lips curling into a polished, practiced smile. Well, she said, her voice dripping with amusement. Dorian, you didn't tell us you were bringing company. Dorian, sensing the edge in her tone, slid a casual arm around Ava's waist. Is there a problem, Celeste? Celeste's smile widened. Not at all. I just assumed your taste in women was a little more refined. Ava felt the insult land like a slap. She could see the way Celeste's eyes swept over her, assessing, judging. Who is she? Where did she come from? Why is someone like her standing next to someone like him? Ava met Celeste's gaze with a cool, steady stare. And then she smiled. I assumed your manners were more refined, she said lightly, sipping her champagne. For a split second, Celeste's mask slipped. Dorian chuckled, clearly entertained. Careful, Celeste. You might actually like her if you give her a chance. Celeste scoffed and turned away, whispering something to the other women. They laughed. Ava's stomach twisted, but she refused to let them see her sweat. This was Dorian's world, and she was sinking in it. Part 2. The Cost of Belonging. As the night went on, Ava watched the elite in action. She saw how easily they dismissed the staff, the waiters, the bartenders, the assistants who worked tirelessly to keep everything perfect. She saw how casually they spent money, tossing around figures that could change someone's entire life. She saw how they spoke about people like her, as if they weren't real. She heard whispers of power plays, backstabbing deals, affairs hidden behind closed doors. And through it all, Dorian stood at the center of it, completely at home. Ava couldn't understand it. She turned to him at one point, lowering her voice. Do you even like these people? She asked. Dorian smirked, sipping his drink. Not particularly. Then why do you surround yourself with them? He shrugged. Because this is how the game is played. Ava frowned. What game? Dorian's expression darkened slightly. The one where you either win or you become irrelevant. Ava hated that answer, because it meant that even someone as powerful as Dorian Lancaster wasn't really free. Part 3. A New Perspective. As the night went on, Dorian started seeing the world through Ava's eyes. It happened gradually in small, quiet moments. Like when he noticed how the servers tensed whenever a guest snapped their fingers, knowing they had to be perfect or risk being humiliated. Or when he saw how Ava greeted the waitstaff, thanking them like they were people, not just background characters. Or when he realized that, for all his wealth, he had never truly paid attention to the way his world functioned. At one point, Ava excused herself and stepped out onto the balcony, needing a moment of silence. Dorian followed. "You hate it here," he said, watching her lean against the railing. Ava sighed. "I don't hate it. I don't understand how you stand it." Dorian exhaled. "You get used to it." Ava turned to him. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." He smirked, but there was something else in his expression, something thoughtful. For the first time in his life, Dorian Lancaster questioned the world he had always taken for granted. Part 4. When the lines begin to blur. Ava wasn't supposed to matter to him. She was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a convenient lie to fix a scandal. But that night, as they stood in the glow of the city lights, something shifted. It was in the way she looked at him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with honesty. It was in the way he let down his guard, just for a moment. It was in the way the world felt quieter when they were alone. Ava shook her head, breaking the silence. "This whole thing is insane." Dorian chuckled. "And yet, here we are." Ava exhaled. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if you weren't this?" Dorian tilted his head. "This? Rich, powerful, trapped in a world where you can't even tell who your real friends are." Dorian's smirk faltered, because he did think about it, more than he cared to admit. He looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "What about you? If you could be anything, what would you be?" Ava blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just know I don't want to be invisible." Something about that answer hit Dorian harder than he expected. Ava turned back to the city lights. "Anyway, this is all fake, right? Just a deal." Dorian hesitated for a second too long. Then he smirked. "Of course, just a deal." But neither of them believed that anymore. Ava had stepped into Dorian's world, but she wasn't just adapting to it. She was changing it. And Dorian was starting to wonder, had he made a deal with the wrong person? Or had he finally met the only person who saw him for who he really was? When pretend becomes real, feelings get in the way. A dangerous realization. Ava had spent weeks reminding herself that this wasn't real. It was an arrangement, a business deal disguised as romance, meant to fool the media and salvage Dorian Lancaster's reputation. And yet, somewhere between the staged dinners, the forced smiles, and the whispered conversations away from prying eyes, something shifted. She noticed it in the way her heartbeat quickened whenever he leaned in too close. She felt it in the moments when he wasn't playing a role, when the mask slipped, and she saw something raw in his expression. Dorian Lancaster, for all his arrogance and privilege, was not the man she had imagined him to be. He wasn't just another billionaire who cared about nothing but himself. There was depth in his silence. There was a quiet kind of loneliness in his gaze. And that terrified her, because the moment she started seeing him as more than a rich, entitled man, the moment she allowed herself to feel something real, she lost control of the game. And Ava had spent her entire life fighting to stay in control. Part 2. Dorian's changing perspective. Dorian had played this game 1,000 times before. He knew how to charm, manipulate, and control a situation. He had been raised in a world where emotions were liabilities, where attachments were weaknesses. But Ava Sinclair was different. She didn't fall for the luxury, the power, or the effortless charm that made other women melt. She challenged him. She questioned him, made him uncomfortable in ways no one else dared. She saw the cracks in his perfect image, and instead of looking away, she called him out on them. And for the first time in his life, Dorian cared what someone else thought of him. It wasn't about appearances anymore. He didn't just want the media to believe their relationship, he wanted her to believe it. He wanted to know what she was thinking when she fell silent. He wanted to understand why she looked at the world with both fire and exhaustion in her eyes. And that realization was dangerous, because he wasn't supposed to care. And yet he did. Part 3. The mistake that changed everything. Dorian had built an empire on control. He controlled his company, his image, his reputation. So when he saw the way the media still scrutinized Ava, questioning whether she was worthy of him. He did what he had always done. He fixed the problem. He made a call. Within hours, Ava's image was carefully managed. Suddenly, stylists were reaching out to offer her makeovers. Journalists who had once ridiculed her began releasing articles portraying her as a woman of substance. Doors that had once been slammed shut in her face were now swinging open. And Ava noticed. She noticed how suddenly people who once sneered at her now smiled. She noticed how invitations arrived at her door for events she had no business attending. And when she confronted Dorian, she realized why. "You did this," she accused, standing in the middle of his penthouse, arms crossed, fire in her eyes. Dorian didn't even flinch. "I was helping you." Ava let out a short, humorless laugh. "Helping me? By what? Buy me a better reputation?" Dorian sighed, as if this was just another problem to solve. "The media would have ripped you apart if I didn't step in." Ava shook her head, her stomach twisting with anger. "You don't get it, do you? I don't want your money, your influence, or your perfectly orchestrated favors." Dorian exhaled. "Ava, no." She took a step closer, voice low, controlled but furious. "You think you can fix everything by throwing money at it. But you can't buy me, Dorian." Something flickered in his gaze. "That's not what I was trying to do. But that's exactly what you did." Dorian went quiet. For the first time, he didn't know how to fix this. Walking away, Ava's hands clenched into fists. She had let herself believe in him, just for a moment. She had let herself think that maybe, behind the arrogance and the wealth, there was someone real. But this was proof that Dorian Lancaster would always be exactly who she thought he was. A man who had never struggled a day in his life. A man who didn't understand what it meant to fight for something that couldn't be bought. She stepped back. This was a mistake. Dorian's jaw tightened. "Ava, no." She cut him off. "I should have known better." She turned, heading toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Dorian watched her go, his expression unreadable. He could have stopped her. He could have said something to make her stay. But for the first time in his life, Dorian Lancaster didn't have the right words. And Ava walked away. What had started as a lie had become something neither of them expected. But now, that fragile illusion was breaking apart. And neither of them knew if there was anything real left to hold on to. The third party appears. Loss and misunderstanding. 1,300 words. The ghost from the past. Ava should have seen it coming. She had told herself over and over again that she didn't belong in Dorian Lancaster's world. And tonight, she had the unfortunate privilege of being reminded exactly why. The gala was another high-profile event, filled with Manhattan's wealthiest elites, and Ava had learned to navigate these circles with careful precision. She had trained herself to ignore the whispers, the scrutinizing glances, the silent judgment. But then, Alice Walker appeared. She was the kind of woman who belonged in Dorian's world. Effortlessly elegant, wealthy by birth, a legacy, not a newcomer. And, as Ava soon learned, his former fiancée. Ava stood stiffly beside Dorian as Alice approached with a polished, unreadable smile, the kind that hid more than it revealed. "Ava Sinclair," she said, her tone deceptively pleasant. "I've heard so much about you." Ava returned the smile, though hers was sharper, colder. "Funny, I haven't heard a thing about you." Alice laughed softly, her gaze flickering toward Dorian. "Oh, I'm sure he meant to tell you. After all, Dorian and I, well, we have quite the history." Ava didn't flinch, but her grip tightened around the champagne glass she was holding. Dorian, to his credit, remained impassive. "Alice, what are you doing here?" Alice arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "What? I can't attend an event without an agenda." Dorian's expression darkened. "With you, there's always an agenda." Ava felt the tension coil between them, a past she hadn't been privy to one that, until this moment, she had never even known existed. Alice turned back to Ava, a slow, assessing glance sweeping over her. "You're quite the enigma," she mused. "No one saw you coming. One day, you're serving tables, and the next, you're on Dorian's arm. It's almost like magic." Ava hated the way Alice said it, like she was some cheap trick, an illusion that would soon disappear, like she didn't belong. The seed of doubt. Ava didn't want to care. She didn't want Alice's words to matter, to stick under her skin like tiny, barbed thorns. But they did. Because Alice wasn't wrong. Ava had been thrown into a world where she didn't belong, and no matter how much she played the role, no matter how many expensive gowns she wore, she would never truly be one of them. Alice saw it. The entire world saw it. And maybe, just maybe, Dorian saw it too. Later that night, when the gala had ended and the last champagne flute had been drained, Ava sat in silence as their car glided through the dimly lit streets of Manhattan. Dorian noticed. "You've barely said a word," he murmured, eyes flicking toward her. "Something wrong?" Ava exhaled. "Why didn't you tell me about her?" Dorian was quiet for a moment. "Because she's in the past. She doesn't matter." Ava gave a bitter laugh. "She certainly seems to think she does." Dorian frowned. "Ava, do you ever wonder," she interrupted, her voice quieter now, "what people say when we're not listening?" Dorian's jaw tightened. "I don't care what they say. That's the difference between us." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I do." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Dorian stared at her, something dangerously close to panic flickering in his eyes. "Ava, don't do this." But she already had, because this wasn't real. This was a lie. And Ava refused to be the woman who tricked herself into believing a lie was love. Walking away, she left before sunrise, before she could convince herself to stay, before she could fall any deeper into something that was never meant to last. Dorian woke up to find her side of the bed empty, the only trace of her existence a single note left on the nightstand. "I won't be another story for them to tear apart." Dorian stared at the words, his chest tightening, his fists clenching. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of control. But for the first time, he had lost something that actually mattered. He had lost her. The weight of loss. Dorian Lancaster had never been the kind of man to chase after someone. People left. That was life. He had been trained to accept loss with indifference, to move on, to replace what was broken rather than try to fix it. But this was different. For the first time, he understood what it meant to want, to need, and the terrifying realization that he needed Ava more than she needed him nearly broke him. He thought of her voice, the way she challenged him. He thought of her fire, the way she refused to be tamed. He thought of the way she saw him not as a billionaire, not as a public figure, but as a man. And now, she was gone. Dorian stood in his penthouse, staring out over the city skyline, his chest hollow. For the first time in his life, money couldn't fix this. Power couldn't bring her back, because Ava Sinclair wasn't something that could be bought. And now, he had to figure out how to get her back. Ava had left before she could become another casualty of Dorian's world. But Dorian wasn't willing to let her slip away so easily. And whether she liked it or not, their story wasn't over yet. Exposed, the pressure of fame, the lie unravels. It started as a whisper, a single article from a small-time gossip blog, questioning the authenticity of Ava Sinclair and Dorian Lancaster's relationship. Then another, and another. Within days, the internet was ablaze with accusations and speculation. Fake romance? Dorian Lancaster's so-called love story crumbles. Who is Ava Sinclair? Just another gold digger playing the long game. Ava's stomach twisted as she scrolled through the endless flood of headlines, each more brutal than the last. She had known deep down, she had always known that this would never last. But she hadn't expected it to end like this. Not with her name being dragged through the mud. Not with her entire existence being reduced to a headline. And yet, here she was, caught in the wreckage of a lie she had agreed to. The backlash. The hate came fast. Online, her inbox overflowed with insults, strangers tearing her apart, questioning her character, assuming the worst. She's disgusting. Women like her ruin everything. Wow. Imagine selling yourself for a billionaire's attention. Pathetic. Gold digger. Fake. Liar. Attention whore. Ava stared at the words, her fingers tightening around her phone. It didn't matter that she wasn't what they said she was. It didn't matter that they didn't know her at all. In their eyes, she had played the game and lost. And now, she was paying the price. But the worst part? The people around her, the ones who had once smiled, once treated her like she belonged, were suddenly nowhere to be found. They had turned their backs the moment the scandal hit. Ava had never felt more alone. Dorian's response. Dorian was furious. The morning after the news broke, he stormed into his father's office, slamming a printed copy of the latest headline onto the desk. "You knew," he accused. "You let them do this to her." William Lancaster barely looked up. "You knew this would happen eventually." Dorian's blood boiled. This isn't just some PR mess. This is her life. His father sighed, setting his pen down. "Dorian, you need to understand something." Dorian's fists clenched. He already knew what was coming. "She was never going to last," Williams said simply. "She doesn't belong in our world. And now, she's learning that the hard way." Dorian's jaw tightened. "She doesn't deserve this." William shrugged. "Maybe not, but you can't save her." Dorian refused to accept that. He left the office and immediately went into damage control mode. He called every journalist he knew, every contact, every person who owed him a favor. He had power. He had influence. And he was going to use it. But what he didn't expect, Ava didn't want his help. Ava's choice. Dorian showed up at Ava's apartment later that night. She opened the door, eyes tired, face pale, but there was a fierceness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "I have a plan," he said immediately. "We make a statement together. We tell them we're still together. No," Ava interrupted. Dorian blinked. "What?" She crossed her arms. "I'm not doing this anymore." "Ava, you can't just—" "Yes, I can," she cut him off. "You don't get it, do you? This was never your battle to fight." Dorian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'm just trying to fix this." "I don't need you to fix this," Ava said, voice steady. Dorian froze. Because for the first time, he believed her. This wasn't the same woman who had once been afraid of the spotlight, who had once hesitated to speak up for herself. This was someone who had been burned and refused to let it happen again. Ava took a deep breath. "I let everyone else control my story for too long. I'm done letting them win." Dorian stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly he nodded, taking back control. The next morning, Ava did the unthinkable. She went live. Not through a media outlet. Not through Dorian's PR team. She turned on her phone, looked directly into the camera, and spoke for herself. "I'm Ava Sinclair," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "And this is my story." She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't defend herself. She just told the truth. How it started. Why she agreed. How she had lost herself along the way. She admitted that it had been a mistake, but she refused to let the world define her by one choice. "I made a decision," she said. "A bad one. But I am more than a scandal. And I refuse to let anyone else tell me who I am." The backlash was instant. But something strange happened. People started listening. Not just the ones who hated her, but the ones who had been watching quietly, waiting for her to fight back. Ava Sinclair, the girl who had once been a footnote in someone else's story, was now writing her own. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid anymore. The lie had been exposed. The world had tried to break her. But Ava wasn't just a scandal. She was a survivor. And now, the real battle was only just beginning. The final choice. Can they accept the truth? 1,300 words. Dorian's realization. Dorian Lancaster had spent his entire life choosing power over people. It was what he had been raised to do, to see emotions as weaknesses, to prioritize control above all else. But now, for the first time, he was powerless. Because the woman he wanted, the woman he couldn't stop thinking about, had walked away. And the terrifying part? She was strong enough to never look back. He saw it in the way she stood on her own, facing down the media storm without his help. He saw it in the way she reclaimed her story, refused to be a victim, refused to be defined by him. Ava Sinclair didn't need him, but he needed her. And that realization was unbearable, because it meant he had to do something he had never done before. He had to fight for someone, not with money, not with power, with nothing but the truth. Ava's transformation. Ava never thought she would reach a point where she could look at Dorian Lancaster and not feel like she was standing in a shadow. But now, she saw herself clearly. She wasn't the same girl who had been struggling to survive in the back corners of a restaurant, invisible to the world. She wasn't a footnote in someone else's story. She had fought. She had survived. And now, for the first time, she was choosing herself. But the hardest part? Admitting that she still wanted him. Because wanting Dorian Lancaster meant risking everything again. And she wasn't sure if she could survive losing him a second time. The decision they can't avoid. It was late when he finally found her. She was sitting on a quiet rooftop, watching the city lights, the skyline stretching endlessly before her. Dorian hesitated, then stepped forward. "You're avoiding me," he said simply. Ava didn't look at him. "I thought that's what you wanted." Dorian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was an idiot." Ava smirked. "That's the first true thing you've said all night." He let out a short laugh, but quickly sobered. "I messed up," he admitted. "I try to control things the way I always do. I try to fix things instead of just listening." Ava finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" Dorian took a deep breath. "Now, I just want to tell you the truth." She folded her arms. "Go on." He met her gaze, raw, unguarded. "I love you, Ava." Ava's heart stopped. Dorian had said a lot of things to her over the past few months, but never this. Never something so real, so terrifyingly honest. She swallowed. "You don't love me, Dorian. You love the idea of me." Dorian shook his head. "No, I love you. Not the media version. Not the scandal. Not the woman I thought I could shape into something more palatable." He stepped closer. "I love you, Ava. The way you fight. The way you see the world differently. The way you call me out on my bullshit. The way you never let me get away with anything." His voice lowered. "I love you because you make me want to be better." Ava felt everything unravel inside her. Because he meant it. But was that enough? Choosing the unknown. Ava had always told herself that Dorian's world wasn't hers. She had spent so long believing that she would never fit in, that no matter how much she changed, she would always be the outsider. But maybe she had been asking the wrong question. Maybe it wasn't about whether she fit into his world. Maybe it was about whether he fit into hers. She took a breath. "If I say yes, if I choose this, you need to understand something." Dorian waited, patient, silent. "I don't need your protection," she said. "I don't need your money, or your name, or some carefully constructed version of a love story." He nodded. "I know. I need you to meet me in the middle," she continued. "Not in your world. Not in mine. Somewhere else. Somewhere new." For the first time, Dorian smiled a real smile, not the polished version he wore for the cameras. "Then let's build it together." Ava exhaled, something inside her finally settling. And just like that, she knew. She was done running. She had made her choice. Dorian Lancaster wasn't her escape. He was her next chapter. And this time, she was writing the story on her own terms. Dorian had finally chosen love over power. And Ava had finally chosen herself. But the hardest part of love? It's never just about choosing someone. It's about choosing them over and over again. And now, the real journey was only just beginning. Is happiness real, or just an illusion? The fight within. Ava had spent her entire life believing that happiness was something other people got to have. Not her. She had seen too much, been through too much. She had spent years scraping by, learning to be invisible, surviving in a world that never spared a second glance for girls like her. And now, she was standing at the edge of something real. But was it worth the risk? Could she trust it? Could she trust him? Because loving Dorian Lancaster wasn't just about choosing him. It was about choosing a life that terrified her. A life where she would always be watched, judged. A life where people would never stop whispering behind her back. Ava wasn't sure if she could survive that again. And yet, despite everything, there was one truth she couldn't ignore. She wanted him. But was that enough? Dorian's redemption. Dorian had never been the kind of man to fight for something he wasn't sure he could win. But Ava was different. She wasn't just someone he wanted. She was someone he needed. And he knew he had to prove that to her. Not with grand gestures. Not with money or power. But with honesty. So, for the first time in his life, Dorian Lancaster let himself be vulnerable. He found Ava where he always seemed to find her. Alone, lost in thought. Standing at crossroads she wasn't sure how to navigate. "Ava," he said, voice quiet but steady. She didn't turn around. "You shouldn't be here." Dorian ignored that. "I need you to listen." She exhaled sharply. Dorian, I don't care what the world thinks, he interrupted. I don't care about the headlines, or the rumors, or the people who will never believe this is real. Ava finally turned to face him. Then what do you care about? His gaze held hers, unwavering. You, he said. I care about you. Ava's breath caught. But Dorian wasn't done. I know I've made mistakes. I know I try to control things because that's all I've ever known how to do. He took a step closer. But I don't want to control you, Ava. I just want to love you. Ava swallowed hard. Love isn't enough, Dorian. His jaw tightened. It's a start. The truth they can't ignore. Ava wanted to argue. She wanted to push him away, to tell him that this wasn't a fairy tale, that love didn't magically fix everything. But then, she looked at him, really looked at him, and she saw it. The fear in his eyes. The desperation of a man who had never learned how to love, but was willing to try. And suddenly, Ava understood. This wasn't about happily ever after. It wasn't about fairy tales or perfect endings. It was about two people who had been lost for too long, finally finding each other. And for the first time, she let herself say the words she had been too afraid to admit. When not a fairy tale, she whispered. Dorian's breath hitched. Ava stepped closer, placing a hand over his heart. But we're real. And sometimes, real was enough. Choosing each other. Loving Dorian Lancaster wouldn't be easy. It would be messy, complicated, chaotic. But love wasn't supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be worth it. And this? He was worth it. Ava looked up at him, meeting his gaze. I don't want to be your secret, she said. I don't want to be something you have to protect or fix. Dorian cupped her face, his touch impossibly gentle. You never were. Ava took a breath. And then, she made her choice. Not because of fate. Not because of some grand, predestined love story. But because she finally saw him. And he finally saw her. So when Dorian leaned in, pressing his lips to hers, Ava didn't hesitate. Because this time, she wasn't running. This time, she was choosing to stay. Was happiness real? Maybe. Maybe not. But Ava and Dorian weren't searching for perfect. They were searching for something real. And sometimes, that was even better. A new world, redefining the value of life. Ava's choice, becoming her own person. For the first time in her life, Ava Sinclair was making a decision that wasn't about survival. She wasn't fighting against something, running from something, or being forced into a corner. She was choosing herself, and that meant she couldn't just be Dorian Lancaster's woman. For so long, Ava had been seen through the lens of who she was to someone else. The waitress, the scandal, the distraction, and then the girlfriend. But who was she when no one else was looking? That was the real question. She needed to find the answer before she could truly share her life with someone else. So she made a decision. She didn't leave Dorian, but she did tell him, very clearly, I love you, but I refuse to be defined by you. Dorian didn't argue. He simply nodded. Good, because I don't want you to be. It was the first time someone had ever let her choose herself without making her feel guilty for it. And that, more than anything, told her she had made the right choice. Part 2. Dorian's choice, letting go of the old world. Dorian Lancaster had spent his whole life chasing power. It had been ingrained in him since childhood. The company, the legacy, the endless need to be in control. But for the first time, he saw it for what it really was, a golden cage. A trap disguised as success. And Ava had helped him see that. Not by forcing him, not by giving him an ultimatum, just by existing outside of it. She had shown him there was another way to live. And so, Dorian walked away. He sold a controlling stake in his company. Not because he didn't care about it, he did, but because he had built it on the wrong foundation. Power, ego, a desperate need to prove himself. And now, he wanted to build something that actually mattered. So instead of billion-dollar mergers, he started working on community-driven projects. Instead of high-rise boardrooms, he spent his time in neighborhoods that had been overlooked for too long. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was building something real. Part 3. Love without validation. Ava and Dorian didn't need to prove their love to the world. They didn't need a headline to validate it. They didn't need a public declaration to make it real. Because love wasn't about convincing people. It was about choosing each other every single day. They still argued. They still challenged each other. They still had moments of doubt. But the difference now? They knew who they were both as individuals and as a couple. They weren't chasing an illusion of love. They were building something solid, something lasting. Not because of fate, not because of destiny, but because they wanted it to work. And that was the most powerful love of all. Writing their own story. Ava had spent so long thinking life had to be a fairy tale. That happiness was something you either had or didn't have, like a switch that flipped when everything finally fell into place. But now she understood the truth. Life wasn't a perfect story. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't clean. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of choices. And that was what made it beautiful. So no, Ava and Dorian weren't living a fairy tale, but they were living their own story. And in the end, that was better. Happiness isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to create something meaningful even when it's imperfect. And now, Ava and Dorian weren't just surviving. They were living on their own terms. What a journey. Love, betrayal, and unexpected twist this story had it all. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to Stories TH for more powerful stories like this. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love.